This is the second video on our privacy discussion, and we are at slide 14 if you're following along with the PowerPoint, but otherwise you can just listen whichever suits you best. And when we just stopped on our last mini video, we were just talking about sector-specific legislation. We had learned in the first video that the privacy legislation federal covers the public offices, so things like government agencies and how they have to conduct their services. PIPEDA covers the companies, essentially, which can sometimes include not-for-profits, but doesn't always. And we also learned that some jurisdictions, like Alberta, BC, and Quebec, have their own specific legislation with regards to how electronic information is used, which has been accepted and is used instead of PIPEDA in those jurisdictions predominantly. And then we're just learning about the fact that some areas have their own specific area. We talked about health as something having some of its own particular legislation. And we also learned that banks have their own particular legislation, which is called the Bank Act. And we're just at this section now on slide 14, saying financial abuse of older adults, PIPEDA, and banking. So really one of the crux of the issues is financial institutions are expressing concern about the fact that they are caught in a betwixt and between situation about PIPEDA. So they have an exemption in the Bank Act, which was brought in a couple of years ago, which says that banks are allowed to report financial abuse when it's suspected. But what's interesting about it is that they didn't say what financial abuse was. So it's not defined anywhere in particular. And so this is a real concern for financial institutions who want to make sure that they are reporting appropriately, but are not actually sure how they're supposed to do it, which would avoid them getting into trouble for breaching their own obligations for confidentiality. So we'll see here that on slide 15, there is an example that's given from a House of Commons statutory review. It says that, when a banker suspects financial abuse, particularly with seniors, and when a customer is withdrawing money from his or her account and it appears the customer may be under pressure from the person accompanying him or her, or the withdrawal is uncharacteristic of that person, that's kind of what we're talking about here. And so before PIPEDA, banks were allowed sometimes to disclose information to stop abuse. But since PIPEDA is there, they're caught because they're not allowed to share information, quite appropriately, outside of with their client. So the Bank Act was amended some years back. Again, as I said, it was amended to allow for some reporting to happen. So moving to slide 16, you'll see that the Canadian Bankers Association was the ones that were really leading the charge for this exemption. And so we're really caught in a very difficult situation. For those of you who are interested in learning more, you can certainly look at some of the information which is detailed in a report called Vulnerable Investors, which I wrote with Marion Passmore. It's not directly related to this course, so I only offer it for you in case you want to look it up. But it details this challenge of the banks wanting to be able to disclose, and they're being in trouble for if they allow financial abuse to occur, but at the same time being left in a very difficult and confusing situation, understanding what it is that they're allowed to disclose. So the legislation now in the Bank Act and PIPEDA was, as I say, allow for financial abuse to be disclosed, but we don't know what financial abuse means, and it will only allow them to be disclosed to government, part of government, or an authorized representative. Except there are no definitions for what they mean by government. There are no definitions for what they mean by part of government. Do they mean the public guardian trustee? Do they mean something different? And there's no definition of what they mean by an authorized representative. It could mean perhaps somebody who has a power of attorney, but we don't know what it means. So there have been strong calls to amend the legislation to make much more clear what it is that the banks are obligated to do. From The investment sector, which is differently regulated from the banks, the securities commissions have been working on this as well to provide some clear conduct protocol. And we, in the, if you will, in the sector, have been trying to work with the investment sector to see if we can't get them what we call legal safe harbor, which means if they disclose the information, they do so in good faith, then they should be protected from both regulatory liability and civil liability. In the banking sector, even though it may look like the same thing, they're regulated differently. However, we're still in the same problem that we have. So, as an example, if you went to, and I'll just use an RBC banking, the Bank Act and PIPEDA have this problem where you're only allowed to disclose, financial abuse, which we don't know what it means, to government, part of government, or an authorized representative, none of which we know what it means. And there's really no further guidance than that. If, however, you went over to the RBC investments area, investments are regulated differently. And I'd offer that there's still the same problem a little bit, but the Bank Act doesn't apply, and the industry is regulated by organizations like IROC, which is the